It was a Wednesday morning in October, and I was carrying 2 cups of coffee when the security guard met me at the elevator. I had brought the second cup for Marcus Webb, our CFO, because we had a 9 o'clock and I had passed the Starbucks in the lobby, and it seemed like the kind of small gesture that good colleagues make before difficult conversations. The coffee was a dark roast in a paper cup with my name written in black marker, and I was holding both cups when Derek Shower's assistant, a young woman named Brittany who had never once made eye contact with me comfortably, told me that I would not be attending the 9 o'clock, that my access card had been deactivated as of 7 that morning, and that there was a box of my personal items being brought down from the 14th floor by building services. I stood there for a moment. The elevator opened and closed behind me. The lobby of the Meridian Capitol building was doing what lobbies do at 9 in the morning, people arriving, phones out, the specific purposeful hum of a workday in motion, and I was standing in the middle of it holding 2 cups of coffee that were both, technically mine now since Marcus wasn't getting one. I said, "Can I ask what the reason is?" Brittany said without looking up from her phone, "Mr. Shower will have someone reach out to you with documentation." I said, "Thank you." I set both cups on the reception desk, picked up the box that building services had just arrived with, and walked out of the building onto Peachtree Street into an October morning that was doing nothing more dramatic than being bright and cool and entirely indifferent to what had just happened to me. That was the last time I entered Meridian Capitol as an employee. 31 days later, I walked back into that same building as the majority holder of the client relationships that firm needed to close the most important deal in its history, and Derek Shower sat across a conference table from me and asked, very carefully, what my terms were. I told him I would need to think about it. My name is Veronica. I am 44 years old and I have spent 20 years in corporate finance. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, the second of 4 children, in a household where money was discussed openly and without drama because there was not much of it, and pretending otherwise would have been a waste of the energy my parents did not have. My father drove for a regional freight company for 30 years. My mother worked the front desk at a dental practice for 22 years. They were both, in their different ways, people who operated on the principle that clarity about your situation costs nothing and denial costs everything. I absorbed that principle without anyone explaining it to me explicitly. It was simply in the air of the house, the way certain things that matter most are never formally taught. You learn them by watching. I got my MBA from the University of Virginia's Darden School in 2003, graduated in the top 10% of my class, and went directly into investment banking at a mid-size firm in Atlanta, where I spent 5 years learning the mechanics of deal-making from the inside. The origination, the structuring, the client management, the particular discipline of a profession where your word to a counterparty carries more weight than any document. I worked on 14 closed transactions during those 5 years. I stayed late when I needed to, and I left when the work was done, which is a distinction that sounds simple and is not. I built relationships with clients who were referred to me specifically because people who had worked with me before said I was precise, and I was honest, and I did not make promises I could not keep. Those 3 qualities, in combination, are rarer in financial services than the industry's self-image would suggest. Then I moved to Meridian Capitol. It was 2009, the middle of the financial crisis, which sounds like a strange moment to join a financial advisory firm, but was, on reflection, the right moment. The firms that survived 2009 and 2010 were the ones that had something real underneath them, and Meridian had something real underneath it. I joined as a senior associate, which meant I was taking a step back in title from where I had been, and I took it without hesitation because the quality of the work at Meridian was higher than what I had been doing, and the learning curve was steeper. And steep learning curves at the right institution are worth more than seniority at the wrong one. I was promoted to vice president in 2012, to managing director in 2015, and to chief strategy officer in 2018. I was the first woman to hold that title at the firm, and for a period, the youngest person by 6 years to sit on the executive leadership team. The promotion to chief strategy officer came with a compensation package that reflected the client revenue I was responsible for, an equity participation agreement tied to the firm's performance, and a corner office on the 14th floor with windows that faced east and caught the morning light in a way I found genuinely useful for thinking clearly. I mention the windows because they will matter later. I want to tell you about what those 14 years actually looked like before I tell you about how they ended, because the ending only makes sense if you understand what was being ended. I built my practice at Meridian Capital the way you build anything that is meant to last. One careful relationship at a time, each one genuine, none of them transactional in the way that professional relationships sometimes become when the fee is the point rather than the work. I had clients I had been serving for a decade. I knew their businesses in the specific way that a long-term advisor knows a client's business, which is different from how a consultant knows a client. I understood not just the financials, but the culture, the family dynamics in the family-owned ones, the board tensions in the institutional ones, the particular risk tolerances and growth ambitions and competitive anxieties that shaped every major decision. I was the person they called when something was going wrong before they called anyone else, which is the clearest signal available that a professional relationship has become genuinely trusted. I also built systems, not because anyone asked me to, but because a practice without systems is a practice that only exists in your head, and a practice that only exists in your head is not a practice. It is a promise that can be walked back. I kept a client relationship management system in Salesforce that I set up myself and maintained myself, entirely separate from what the firm kept in its own CRM. Every client call logged, every significant conversation documented with a summary note, every commitment I made tracked against its delivery, every referral source recorded with the date and the context. This was not overhead. This was the record of what I had built, maintained in my own system, accessible to me independent of whatever access the firm chose to grant or revoke. I also kept copies of every engagement letter for every client I had originated, every correspondence archive, every deal summary for transactions I had been the lead advisor on, not in the firm's systems, in my own, password protected, backed up to a personal cloud account, organized by client and by year. This is not the behavior of someone planning a defection. It is the behavior of someone who understands that the record of your work is your professional asset, and professional assets require the same care as financial ones. Derek Schauer had built Meridian Capital from a two-person operation in a Midtown Atlanta office in 2001 into a respected regional player with 43 employees, a coherent deal thesis, and a track record in the Southeast that institutional clients trusted. He was genuinely gifted at originating relationships. He had the kind of presence and memory that made people feel remembered and valued, which in financial services is worth more than most technical competencies. He was less gifted, and I want to be precise here rather than unkind, at acknowledging when someone else's contribution had been essential to an outcome he was being credited for. This is not an uncommon quality in the founders of successful firms. It tends to coexist with genuine ability. It tends not to become a material problem until the precise moment that it does. There had been episodes over the 14 years. A deal in 2014 where I had managed the entire client relationship through a difficult renegotiation, and Derek had presented the outcome to the board as having been driven by his counterparty relationship, which was accurate in one narrow sense and misleading in every practical one. A client pitch in 2016 where I had built the financial model and the strategic framework and Derek had presented without attribution, using the first person throughout in a way that was technically defensible and professionally telling. A performance review in 2017 where my compensation was held flat on the argument that the market had tightened, at a time when the clients I managed were generating more revenue than the prior year. I noted each of these. I did not make scenes about them. I documented them in a personal journal I kept at home, dated, factual, without editorializing. Not because I expected to use the documentation, because I am the daughter of people who understood that the accurate record of a thing, kept clearly and without embellishment, is its own form of accounting. The firing came from a direction I had partially anticipated and at a timing I had not. I had known for 4 months that Derek was in advanced negotiations to sell a majority stake in Meridian Capital to a larger regional financial services group called Harmon Whitfield Partners, based in Columbia, South Carolina, which had been assembling a Southeast advisory platform through strategic acquisition. I had known this because I had built 2 of the 3 financial models the firm used in its preliminary presentations to Harmon Whitfield, and because my client relationships represented approximately 40% of Meridian's annual advisory revenue, a figure that appeared, stated precisely, in the firm's own deal materials. I was, on paper, a significant part of what Harmon Whitfield was buying. What I did not know until the Thursday before that Wednesday in October was that Derek had negotiated my exit as a term of the transaction structure. Harmon Whitfield's leadership wanted consolidated management for the combined entity and a clean organizational chart without a chief strategy officer whose client relationships were personal, portable, and compensated accordingly. Derek, who wanted the deal and wanted it before year-end, had agreed without telling me, without a conversation, without the basic professional courtesy of informing me that a decision about my future had been made in a room I was not invited to attend. I found this out from Patricia Cho, a partner at the law firm handling the transaction, who called me that Thursday ostensibly about a routine matter in a client contract, and who said at the end of the call, in the careful way that careful people communicate things they are not certain they should be communicating, "Veronica, I just want to make sure you have what you need going into next week." I am not able to say more than that. I said, "I understand, Patricia. I appreciate the call." We both understood exactly what had been said without either of us saying it directly. I want to tell you what that call felt like, because the way it felt is relevant to what came next. It felt like confirmation of something I had been half aware of for months without fully assembling into a conclusion. A set of signals I had been noting without connecting, the way you note individual data points before they resolve into a pattern. Derek had been less forthcoming about the Harmon Whitfield timeline than his general communication style warranted. He had stopped including me in certain calls with the transaction team. He had asked once, with a casualness that was clearly deliberate, whether I had given any thought to what I might want to do after Meridian's ownership structure changed. I had answered that question at the time as though it were a general strategic inquiry. After Patricia's call, I understood what it had actually been. I spent that Thursday evening and all of Friday in a meeting with my own attorney, a corporate and employment law specialist named James Ockhaffer, who had an office in Buckhead, and who was the kind of attorney whose reputation alone tends to focus the minds of opposing counsel when they learn he is involved. James read through my employment agreement, my non-compete language, and my equity participation documentation with the careful attention he brought to everything. Then he asked me whether I had maintained my own records of the client engagement documentation for the accounts I had originated and managed directly. I said yes. He asked whether those client relationships were contracted solely through the firm, or whether they contained elements that could fairly be characterized as personal professional relationships that predated or existed independently of Meridian. I said, some of both, and the ones that are personal, I have the correspondence and the relationship history to establish it clearly. James was quiet for a moment in the way he is quiet when he has reached a conclusion. Then he said, "Veronica, what they are about to do to you is legal, but it is not without significant consequence for them. Make sure you are ready to move quickly when it happens." I spent the weekend getting ready. What getting ready looked like, practically, was this. I reviewed every client file in my personal system, identified the 3 institutional clients whose relationships contained the clearest personal professional history, and prepared a factual summary for James of the origination and management history of each one. I reviewed the non-compete language in my employment agreement with James in detail, line by line, and identified the specific limitations in its scope. It prohibited me from joining or founding a directly competing firm within 18 months of departure within a defined geography, but it did not prohibit client-initiated mobility, did not restrict relationships that had predated my Meridian tenure, and did not extend to advisory work in the Tennessee and South Carolina markets, where 2 of my 3 key clients primarily operated. The gaps in the language were not accidents. They reflected what had been negotiated and what had not, and they were the terrain I would need to understand precisely before any conversation about terms. I want to tell you what that weekend felt like specifically, because it is the practical detail that gets left out of stories like this one, and it is the detail that actually matters. I did not spend the weekend in a state of strategic clarity. I spent Friday evening in a state of controlled anger that I did not perform for anyone and processed privately. And I spent Saturday morning running 6 miles on the Beltline instead of my usual 3, because I needed the physical expenditure to get to the mental clarity. By Saturday afternoon, I was at my kitchen table with James's number saved and my employment documentation spread in front of me, and I was working through it the way I work through any problem with financial and legal dimensions, methodically, without skipping steps, starting from the actual language rather than the impression of it. What I found when I read the non-compete language precisely was not a loophole in the dramatic sense. It was a boundary, clearly defined, and the question was whether what I had built fell inside that boundary or outside it. The answer, once I mapped the client relationships against the language, was that the most significant ones fell outside it in ways that were specific and documentable. The Nashville client operated primarily in a market the non-compete did not cover. The Greenville client's relationship predated my Meridian employment by 2 years and was documented as such. The Atlanta referral was contractually characterized as a personal advisory relationship in the original engagement letter, a characterization I had insisted on when the engagement was structured, and that James now understood to be among the most valuable sentences I had ever negotiated into a document. None of this had been planned with this moment in mind. I had insisted on the personal advisory characterization in 2017 because it was accurate, and accuracy in documents matters regardless of what you are planning to do with them. That is what I mean when I say that documentation habits are not defensive strategies. They are the natural expression of a professional commitment to having things be accurate, and they become protective precisely because they are not designed to be. The 3 institutional clients at the center of what followed represented relationships I had built over years through work that was genuinely mine. The first was a regional insurance company based in Nashville, Tennessee, that I had originated as a client during my investment banking years and brought to Meridian when I joined in 2009. The second was a family-owned logistics company in Greenville, South Carolina, that I had taken on as a client in 2011 and that had grown, under a series of advisory engagements I had personally led, into one of the firm's highest value accounts. The third was a financial services holding company in Atlanta that had come to Meridian as a direct referral from a personal contact of mine who had specifically instructed the client to engage me and had made clear that the relationship was personal and portable. Together, these 3 clients represented approximately $2.8 million in annual advisory fees, roughly 22% of Meridian's annual income, and the precise revenue base, the Harmon Whitfield acquisition model, had been built on the assumption of retaining. On the Saturday before that Wednesday, I made 3 phone calls. I did not tell any of my clients that I was about to be terminated. I did not know for certain at that point, and even if I had, there are right ways and wrong ways to move in professional situations, and arranging a pre-termination client defection is definitively the wrong way. What I did was what I had been doing naturally throughout my career. I called to check in, to confirm progress on ongoing work, to ask the questions that a conscientious advisor asks when she is paying attention to her clients' businesses and not just her own schedule. And in each of those conversations, organically, each client said some version of the same thing, that they valued the relationship with me personally, that my continuity and judgment were central to their confidence in the engagement, that any change in my involvement would be something they would want to discuss and understand directly. I noted those comments, not for any strategy I was executing. Because accurate records of what is said are accurate records, and I had been keeping them since before I understood precisely why they would matter. Wednesday came. The lobby, the coffee, the box, Brittany's phone. I walked out onto Peachtree Street and stood in the October morning for a moment, just standing with my cardboard box and the clear air and the light coming off the glass of the building behind me. The October light in Atlanta has a specific quality at 9 in the morning, low and direct, the kind that makes the ordinary world look like it has been thought about. I stood in it for about 30 seconds. Then I called James. He said, "How are you feeling?" I said, "Clear." He said, "Good, come in at 11. The 31 days between that Wednesday and the Monday when I returned to that conference room were not triumphant days, and I will not characterize them as such, because that characterization would not be accurate, and I do not tell inaccurate stories about myself. I had given 14 years to Meridian Capital. I had built a career there that I was genuinely proud of, more than 40 completed mid-market transactions, 3 junior analysts I had mentored who were still at the firm, and whom I cared about professionally and personally, client relationships that had produced real and useful outcomes for organizations that needed advisory guidance, and had received excellent work in exchange for their fees. The firing was wrong in the way it was handled, and Derek had made a calculation about my dispensability that was incorrect, and that he would come to understand more precisely in the weeks that followed. But none of that cancels what was real about those 14 years, and I had to sit with both truths simultaneously, that the work had been real and that the ending was wrong, and find that I could hold them without letting one erase the other. That was not automatic. It took some of those 31 days to learn. There were specific things I did during those 31 days to take care of myself that I am going to tell you about, because I think they matter as much as the legal strategy, and nobody ever talks about them. I ran every morning, 3 miles on the Beltline Trail near my house in Inman Park, early enough that the trail was mostly empty, and I did not have to perform normalcy for anyone. I called my mother in Charlotte on Thursdays because Thursdays had always been our day, and I did not tell her the full situation for the first 2 weeks because I needed to understand it myself before I could explain it to someone else. And my mother is perceptive enough that an incomplete explanation would have worried her more than a complete one. I cooked dinner at home most evenings, which was not something I did often during my years at Meridian because my schedule did not usually accommodate it, and I found that the act of producing a meal from actual ingredients was one of the most stabilizing things I could do with an evening that might otherwise have been spent in the specific anxiety of waiting. I made a pot of lentil soup on the second Thursday that I ate for 3 days. I made a roast chicken on the second Sunday that I ate for 2. I cannot explain precisely why this helped except that it did. There was a specific conversation I had during those 31 days that I have thought about many times since. My younger sister Diane called me on the Friday of the first week, not because she knew what had happened, I had not yet told her, but because she had a habit of calling on Fridays when her own week had been hard, on the theory that if she was having a difficult week, odds were reasonable that I was too. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, which is what Diane does when she is thinking rather than reacting. Then she said, "Do you know what they had?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The clients, the deals, the models you built. Do they know what they had?" I said, "They're learning." She said, "Good, that's the right pace." I thought about that phrase for a long time across the days that followed. The right pace. Not the fastest pace, not the most aggressive pace, not the pace that would produce the most visible demonstration of my value or the most satisfying evidence of Derek's error. The right pace, which is the pace at which accuracy asserts itself clearly enough that it cannot be disputed without embarrassment. I had been moving at the right pace my whole career. I had been building carefully, documenting quietly, maintaining relationships genuinely, and letting the accuracy of what I had done carry its own weight rather than requiring me to perform its value in rooms that were not always disposed to recognize it. That pace had felt slow sometimes, and had been genuinely frustrating at the moments when Derek took credit for outcomes I had driven, and I chose to note rather than confront, and had cost me something in the short term that I was adding up only now. But it had also built something whose value was now undeniable, documented in systems I owned, represented by an attorney who knew exactly what it was worth, and about to be formalized in a consulting agreement that reflected what the situation actually was. The right pace. Diane is almost always right. Diane is a structural engineer in Charlotte, and she has a quality that runs in our family, which is the ability to name the essential thing without ornamentation. What they had. Not what they lost, not what I was owed, not what was fair or unfair. What they had. The question repositioned everything from grievance to inventory. I found it useful. I wrote it at the top of the legal pad I had been working through with James, and I looked at it several times across the following 3 weeks. What I wanted, once I was clear about it, was not revenge. Revenge is the pursuit of an emotional outcome at the cost of a strategic one, and I am not built for that trade. What I wanted was accuracy. I wanted the situation to reflect in concrete and practical terms what my work had actually been worth, to the firm, to the clients, to the transaction that was now in jeopardy because someone had priced my contribution incorrectly. I wanted the record to be right, not dramatized, not minimized, just accurate. That is what my parents had always insisted on, not justice in the abstract, but accuracy in the specific, the honest accounting of a thing. What they had, which they did not fully understand the value of until it was at risk of departure, was not just client relationships. It was the accumulated institutional knowledge of how to do this work well in this region over 14 years. The specific understanding of how mid-market family businesses in the Southeast make decisions. Who the decision makers actually are versus who appears on the org chart. What concerns need to be addressed before a transaction can close. And how to speak to those concerns in a way that moves things forward rather than creating resistance. That kind of knowledge does not transfer in a restructured org chart. You cannot acquire it by terminating the person who holds it and assuming the clients will stay. The clients stay because of the person, and the person was walking out the door with her cardboard box. By day 14, 2 of my 3 institutional clients had formally notified Meridian Capital of their intent to transition their advisory mandates. The third was in active discussions with James and me. The combined revenue at risk was the full $2.8 million, $22% of Meridian's annual income. The exact revenue base the Harmon-Whitfield acquisition model had assumed was stable and transferable. An acquisition valuation built on client relationship continuity does not survive the departure of nearly a quarter of that base in the first 2 weeks of the deal's announcement period. Thomas Harlow, the managing partner at Harmon-Whitfield Partners, was not a man who tolerated structural problems in transactions he had committed capital to close. Derek received a call from Thomas's office on day 17. James received a call from Derek's outside counsel on day 18. Derek called me personally on day 22. He said my name and then he said, "We need to talk." I said, "I know." He said, "Can you come in?" I said, "I'll come in Monday." I spent the weekend before that Monday the same way I had spent the first weekend after the termination. Clearly, without panic, thinking through what I actually wanted from the conversation and what terms would constitute an accurate resolution of the situation. James and I had been building the framework for 3 weeks. It was not punitive and it was not generous. It was calibrated. It reflected what my contribution had been worth and what it needed to be worth in order for the transaction to succeed on the timeline both Derek and Thomas Harlow needed. I reviewed the framework on Sunday evening at my kitchen table with a glass of wine from a bottle I had opened earlier that week, and I felt, for the first time since that Wednesday in October, the specific quiet of a person who knows exactly where they stand. Monday came. I walked back through the Meridian Capital lobby. Brittany was at the reception desk. She looked at me and looked away. The elevator took me to the 14th floor, the same elevator I had taken for 14 years, the same 14th floor, the same conference room with the glass walls and the long walnut table and the upholstered chairs that I had been involved in selecting during the 2019 renovation. The room looked the same as it always had. Derek was there. Marcus Webb, the CFO, was there. The firm's outside counsel was there. And across from them, looking like a man who had driven 3 hours from Columbia, South Carolina, to attend a meeting that had not been in his original transaction timeline, was Thomas Harlow, managing partner of Harmon-Whitfield Partners. I sat down. I set my portfolio on the table. I did not bring coffee for anyone. I want to describe that conference room in the moment before the conversation started, because the room itself communicated something that is relevant to everything that followed. The morning light was coming in from the east-facing windows on the far wall, the same windows I had looked out of on hundreds of mornings across 14 years, the same light I had used to think through difficult problems before the day got crowded with other people's urgencies. When I had chosen my seat, I had chosen the end of the table closest to the door, which put the light behind me and in front of Derek and Thomas both. Not as a tactic, because I knew the room, and the room was mine as much as it had ever been anyone's, and I sat in it accordingly. What followed was 2 hours and 20 minutes of the most focused professional conversation I have had in 20 years of work. Focused not in the sense of tense or adversarial. The tone was controlled throughout, because everyone in that room was a professional, and everyone understood that emotional register had no productive function in a conversation about the structure of a transaction. Focused in the sense that every statement was precise, every number cited was accurate, every position stated was real and documented and defensible. Thomas Harlow was a careful man. I had done my research on him before Monday, read his deal history and his public statements, understood his professional reputation, and careful men respond to precision with a respect they do not always extend to emotion. I gave him precision. Derek spoke carefully too, more carefully than he had probably spoken in years, because the transcript of this conversation was going to matter and he knew it. He had spent 3 weeks understanding what the client's situation actually was, what the legal terrain actually looked like, and what his options actually were. Those 3 weeks had been educational for him. I did not enjoy his discomfort particularly. I noted it without feeling satisfaction about it, which is perhaps the most accurate description of what equanimity actually feels like in practice. Thomas Harlow said about 90 minutes into the conversation that I was a material factor in the transaction's value. He said it precisely without embellishment, in the way that careful men state things they have been thinking about for some time and have decided are worth stating clearly. The room was quiet for a moment after he said it. Derek looked at the table. Marcus looked at the window. The outside counsel looked at his notepad. I looked at Thomas Harlow and said, "I agree with that assessment." What I asked for was the following: a consulting agreement with the successor entity at a rate and on terms that compensated me appropriately for my contribution to the client relationships at issue. structured to cover the period through which the transaction closed, and the client relationships were formally stabilized in the new entity's portfolio. A formal acknowledgement in the transaction documents of my role in originating and managing those accounts. Not a dramatic statement, not an apology, just an accurate record of who had done what, the kind of documentation that should have existed in the firm's own files all along, and a clean release from the non-compete provisions that would otherwise have constrained my independent practice for 18 months following departure. The non-compete release was not negotiable. James had made that clear in the preliminary communications, and I made it clear again in the room. The rest was a matter of calibration. We reached the calibration by early afternoon. Derek Schauer signed the consulting agreement on a Tuesday afternoon in November. He used a Montblanc pen that had been a gift from the CFO of the Nashville Insurance Company, one of my clients, as it happened, on a deal I had structured and closed in 2016. I noticed the pen. I recognized it. I said nothing about it. Some observations belong only to you, and the record you keep privately is sometimes more valuable than the one you make in the room. I want to tell you what it felt like the following morning, because I think it is the most honest and useful part of this story, and it is the part most people do not tell you. I woke up at 6 in the morning in my Inman Park house, and I made coffee and I sat at the kitchen table, and I felt, more than anything, profoundly tired. Not the temporary exhaustion of a difficult month, though it had been that. The deeper tiredness of someone who had spent 20 years doing excellent work, and a significant portion of those 20 years in parallel protecting her stake in it. Quietly, precisely, without complaint, without making it anyone else's problem. Because doing excellent work alone had not always been sufficient to be accurately credited for it. There is a particular cost to that dual running, building with one hand and protecting with the other. That is rarely discussed honestly. It is the energy you spend on documentation that you would rather spend on thinking. It is the mental overhead of maintaining your own systems in parallel with the firm's systems, because you understand that your record and the firm's record are not necessarily the same record. It is the discipline of noting things without reacting to them and filing them without forgetting them year after year, across a career that was also substantively excellent and genuinely rewarding, and not reducible to the defensive structure you built around it. All of that costs something. I felt the cost of it on that Wednesday morning in November, sitting at my kitchen table, and I want to be honest with you about it rather than describing the morning as triumphant, because it was not triumphant. It was the exhaustion of a long, sustained thing finally being finished. I called my mother that morning. She had known by then. I had told her the full situation about 2 weeks into the 31 days when I was clear enough about it to explain it accurately. She had been in the way my mother always is, supportive without being theatrical about it. When I called her that Wednesday morning and told her the agreement was signed, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good, now rest." I said, "I will." She said, "Veronica, you know what your father always said." I said, "I know, Mom." She said it anyway. "Clarity about your situation costs nothing. And if you maintain it long enough, it pays you back." I said, "It paid me back." She said, "Good." I called Diane after that. She answered in one ring. I said, "It's done." She said, "What did they call it in the document?" I said, "Material factor in the transaction's value." She was quiet for a second, and then she started laughing, the specific laugh she has when something is both satisfying and absurd in equal measure. I laughed too. It was the first time I had laughed in about 5 weeks without it feeling forced. Here is what I learned from all of it. 4 things, said plainly, because plainness is what these lessons deserve. The first is that your professional relationships belong to you, not to your employer. This is something organizations have a structural interest in obscuring, and it is something most people in professional services learn only at the precise moment they need the lesson most. A client who came to your firm because of you specifically, who works with you directly, who calls your cell phone rather than the main line, whose business came to the firm because of a referral directed personally to you. That relationship exists because of you. It is yours in the way that your professional reputation is yours, which is completely. Document your role in it. Maintain it as the genuine relationship it is. Not because you are planning to leave, but because it is accurate, and accurate records of what is yours cost nothing except the discipline to maintain them. Build the Salesforce instance yourself if you have to. Keep the correspondence archive. Log the calls. Not as preparation for departure, but as basic hygiene for a professional life you intend to own. The second is about non-compete agreements. Read yours. Not the general impression of it, the specific language. Understand what it prohibits and what it does not. Most non-competes are designed to prevent direct competitive activity within a defined scope and geography. Most are not designed to prevent client-initiated mobility or to restrict relationships that predated the firm or to limit work that falls outside the defined competitive boundaries. The gaps in the language are not accidents. They reflect what the drafting attorney was asked to protect and what they were not. Know where the gaps are before you need to know. The right time to read your non-compete is not when you are about to leave. It is now. The third is about what happens when someone misprices you. Derek's calculation in October was that I was eliminable, that my client relationships were transferable to the firm independent of my continued presence, and that the deal he wanted could proceed without accurately accounting for what I contributed to it. He was wrong on all three counts, and the consequence of being wrong fell entirely on his transaction, his timeline, and his negotiating position. This was not engineered by me. It was the natural result of a situation that did not conform to his assessment of it. And reality in financial transactions asserts itself with particular clarity when a valuation depends on accuracy. Your job is to do work that is genuine, maintain relationships that are real, keep documentation that is clean, and build systems that are yours. When the situation requires accuracy, when a transaction depends on it, when a valuation is stress-tested by events, the truth of your situation carries its own weight without needing your help. The fourth thing is the one I did not anticipate learning, and it is the one that has stayed with me longest. The dual running, the building and the protecting, the work and the documentation, the professional excellence and the parallel maintenance of the record of that excellence costs something real. It is the toll of operating in environments that do not automatically recognize what they have until the moment of its potential departure. I am not telling you to stop building, or to stop protecting, or to be resentful of the cost. I am telling you to know that the cost is real, and to account for it honestly, the way my parents accounted honestly for the real costs of their lives. To rest when the chapter is finished. To call your sister when the document is signed. To sit at the kitchen table in the morning with coffee that is still warm and let yourself feel the full weight of what you carried before you decide where you are going next. My independent practice is in Atlanta, at an office in Ponce City Market on the 4th floor, with east-facing windows that catch the morning light in a way that makes the first hour of the day feel like it belongs entirely to me. I have 3 institutional clients and a 4th in serious preliminary conversations. I have a French press I bought at a kitchen store on North Highland Avenue and a Chemex I bought 3 weeks later when I decided the French press was not precise enough, which tells you something accurate about my character. I do not bring cups for anyone who has not earned them, and I no longer work in rooms where the record of what I contribute can be misattributed without consequence. The cardboard box is still in my hall closet in Inman Park. I have kept it because it is accurate. It is the true record of a Wednesday morning when someone calculated incorrectly what he was losing and sent building services to bring it downstairs and had his assistant deliver the news without looking up from her phone. I have kept it because I am the daughter of people who understood that the accurate record of a thing, kept clearly and without embellishment, is both its own protection and its own accounting. Clarity about your situation costs nothing. And if you maintain it long enough, with enough precision and without flinching, it pays you back in full.